The pre-dawn darkness of September 26, 1918, shattered like glass under the thunderous roar of 2,700 Allied artillery pieces. Private William Henderson of the 77th Infantry Division pressed his face against the muddy trench wall as the earth trembled beneath him, each explosion sending cascades of dirt into his helmet. This was no ordinary bombardment. This was the opening symphony of what would become the largest and bloodiest American military operation in World War I. General John Joseph Pershing stood in his command post, maps spread before him like a surgeon's tools, knowing that the next 47 days would either crown the American Expeditionary Forces with glory or bury them in the unforgiving mud of the Argonne forest. The weight of history pressed upon his shoulders as heavily as the autumn rain that had been falling for 3 days straight. 600,000 American soldiers, supported by French forces, were about to test themselves against the most formidable defensive system the German Empire had ever constructed. The Hindenburg Line stretched before them like a concrete and steel serpent, its belly filled with machine gun nests, observation posts, and artillery emplacements that had been perfected over 4 years of brutal warfare. The Germans had chosen their ground well. The Argonne forest provided natural concealment for their defensive positions, while the rolling hills and dense woodlands would fragment any attacking force into vulnerable, isolated units. Crown Prince Ruprecht of Bavaria had personally overseen the construction of these defenses, confident that they would hold against any assault the war-weary Allies could muster. As referenced in military historian Edward Lengel's comprehensive analysis of the offensive, the strategic importance of this sector could not be overstated. Control of the Meuse-Argonne region would sever the vital railway line that supplied German forces across the Western Front. Lieutenant Colonel George Patton, commanding the 304th Tank Brigade, checked his watch in the gray morning light. His tanks, the new Mark V heavies and the lighter Renault FTs, were positioned along the front like steel beasts awaiting their master's command. The young officer had spent months studying the German defensive tactics, and he knew that success would depend not just on firepower, but on the ability to maintain momentum through the maze of trenches and obstacles that lay ahead. The silence that followed the artillery barrage was more terrifying than the noise itself. In that moment of supernatural quiet, broken only by the distant cries of wounded men and the settling of debris, every American soldier along the 24-mile front understood that they were about to write a new chapter in their nation's military history. Some would return home as heroes, others would remain forever in the blood-soaked soil of France. Sergeant Alvin York of the 82nd Infantry Division adjusted his rifle sling and whispered a prayer his mother had taught him in the Tennessee mountains. Round him, men from every corner of America, farm boys from Iowa, factory workers from Detroit, college students from Boston prepared to advance into hell itself. The diversity of the American forces was both their strength and their challenge. These men had never fought together before, yet they were expected to overcome defenses that had stopped the best European armies for years. As the first American soldiers climbed out of their trenches and into no man's land, they carried with them the hopes of a nation that had entered the war reluctantly, but now demanded victory at any cost. The Meuse-Argonne offensive had begun, and with it, the transformation of the United States from a regional power into a global military force that would reshape the 20th century. The first waves of American infantry surged forward through the morning mist like a gray tide, their bayonets gleaming in the pale September sun. Captain Charles Whittlesey of the 77th Infantry Division watched his men advance across the shell-torn landscape, their formations already beginning to fragment under the withering fire from concealed German machine gun positions. The carefully planned assault was dissolving into chaos within minutes of its commencement. Private First Class Henry Johnson of the 369th Infantry Regiment, one of the African-American units fighting alongside French forces, found himself separated from his squad as they pushed through the dense undergrowth of the Argonne forest. The sound of rifle fire echoed through the trees like deadly percussion, punctuated by the distinctive chatter of German Spandau machine guns that seemed to fire from every shadow and fallen log. Johnson's regiment, known as the Harlem Hellfighters, had already proven themselves in earlier engagements, but nothing had prepared them for the systematic brutality of the German defensive system. The German defenders, many of them veterans, of the Eastern Front who had been transferred west after Russia's collapse, fought with the desperate efficiency of men who knew they were making their last stand. Oberst Wilhelm von Steuben, commanding the German forces in this sector, had spent months preparing his positions, creating interlocking fields of fire that turned every advance into a deadly gauntlet. His machine gunners, positioned in concrete bunkers and camouflaged positions, waited until the Americans were within 50 yards before opening fire, maximizing the carnage. Major General Robert Lee Bullard, commanding the 1st Corps, received fragmented reports from his forward observers that painted a picture of mixed success and devastating losses. The 28th Infantry Division had managed to penetrate the first line of German trenches, but had become pinned down by counterattacks from the reserve positions. The 35th Infantry Division, composed largely of National Guard units from Kansas and Missouri, had suffered particularly heavy casualties when they encountered a previously unknown German strong point that their intelligence had failed to identify. As noted in the comprehensive military records compiled by the U.S. Army Center of Military History, the complexity of coordinating such a massive assault across difficult terrain with inexperienced troops created numerous tactical challenges that would influence American military doctrine. For decades to come, the weather conspired against the attackers as autumn rain turned the battlefield into a quagmire that swallowed men and equipment alike. Tank crews found their machines bogged down in shell holes and mud, while artillery pieces had to be manhandled through terrain that defied all attempts at mechanized transportation. The carefully planned logistical system that was supposed to supply the advancing troops began to break down under the strain of combat conditions and the sheer scale of the operation. Private Michael O'Brien from the 4th Infantry Division discovered the true horror of modern warfare when his platoon stumbled into a German gas attack. Near the village of Montfaucon, the chlorine gas, delivered by artillery shells that burst with an almost gentle pop, created a yellow-green cloud that drifted across the battlefield like a malevolent fog. O'Brien fumbled for his gas mask, his hands shaking as he watched comrades who had been too slow or to panic to protect themselves writhe in agony as the poison burned their lungs and eyes. The German defensive strategy relied heavily on the principle of defense in depth, with each position designed to channel attacking forces into predetermined killing zones. When American units managed to overrun one position, they often found themselves facing an even more formidable obstacle just beyond. The psychological impact of this seemingly endless series of defenses began to take its toll on the attacking troops, who had expected to break through the German lines within the first few days of the offensive. By nightfall on September 26th, the American forces had gained ground, but at a cost that sobered even the most optimistic commanders. Field hospitals behind the lines struggled to cope with the flood of wounded, while grave registration units began the grim task of collecting the dead. The offensive had barely begun, and already it was clear that the price of victory would be measured in tens of thousands of American lives. Major Charles Whittlesey's voice was barely a whisper as he counted his remaining men in the gray dawn of October 2nd, 1918. What had begun as a 500-man battalion of the 77th Infantry Division had been reduced to fewer than 200 soldiers, trapped in a shell crater deep within the Argonne forest, with German forces surrounding them on all sides. The irony was not lost on him that his men, mostly Jewish and Italian immigrants from New York's Lower East Side, had advanced so far beyond the main American lines that they had become prisoners of their own success. The situation had developed with the cruel logic of warfare. Whittlesey's battalion had pushed forward through a gap in the German lines, believing they were part of a coordinated advance. Instead, they had walked into a trap that the Germans had closed behind them with methodical precision, now occupying a position that would forever be remembered as the Lost Battalion. They faced a choice between surrender and a fight to the death against overwhelming odds. Private Abraham Krotoshinsky, a Polish immigrant who had enlisted to prove his American patriotism, volunteered for the most dangerous mission of his life. The battalion's radio had been destroyed in the German barrage, and their only hope lay in getting a message through to the main American lines. Krotoshinsky would have to crawl through German positions, cross no man's land, and somehow reach friendly forces with news of their desperate situation. The young soldier understood that his chances of survival were minimal, but he also knew that without ammunition and medical supplies, his comrades faced certain death. The German commander, General Friedrich von Lossberg, had positioned his forces with characteristic Prussian efficiency. Machine gun nests created overlapping fields of fire that made any movement suicidal, while sniper teams picked off any American soldier who showed himself above the rim of their crater. The Germans had also begun using a new tactic calling in artillery strikes on the American position, using captured coordinates, a psychological warfare technique designed to break the defenders' will to resist. Captain Nelson Holderman Whittlesey's second in command organized the defense with the methodical precision of a man who had studied every manual. On small unit tactics, he positioned his riflemen to cover all approaches, rationed the remaining ammunition with mathematical precision, and organized teams to care for the wounded. Using medical supplies salvaged from the dead, the captain's calm efficiency in the face of certain death inspired his men to continue fighting when surrender seemed the only rational option. As documented in the detailed after-action reports preserved in the National Archives, the Lost Battalion's ordeal became a symbol of American determination and the immigrant spirit that had built the nation, demonstrating that courage in combat transcended ethnic and religious bound. Ares, the Germans, recognizing the propaganda value of capturing such a large American unit intact, sent negotiators under a flag of truce to demand surrender. The terms were generous. The Americans would be treated as prisoners of war. According to the Geneva Convention, their wounded would receive medical attention, and they would be exchanged at the war's end. Whittlesey's response was characteristic of the man who had left his law practice to serve his country. He ordered his men to prepare for the next assault. Private First Class Lowell Hollingshead from Ohio discovered that war reduced men to their most basic instincts when he found himself sharing a shell hole with 3 Germans who had been cut off from their own lines. The bizarre encounter, lasting nearly 6 hours, involved no conversation. None of the men spoke each other's language, but rather a mutual understanding that they were all victims of circumstances beyond their control. When American reinforcements finally arrived, the Germans surrendered without resistance, their will to fight exhausted by the same forces that had tested their captors. The psychological pressure of the siege began to manifest in various ways among the trapped Americans. Some men became hyper-alert, starting at every sound and shadow. Others retreated into themselves, sitting silently and staring at nothing. A few began to crack under the strain, weeping uncontrollably or talking to themselves in low, urgent whispers. Whittlesey and his officers worked constantly to maintain morale, moving among their men with words of encouragement and small acts of leadership that reminded the soldiers they were not alone in their ordeal. The rescue of the lost battalion would require a coordinated effort by multiple American divisions, but first, the main offensive had to regain momentum. The men trapped in the Argonne forest had become a symbol of American determination, but they were also a reminder of the price that would be paid for ultimate victory. Their ordeal was far from over, and the worst was yet to come. The morning of October 8, 1918, dawned with a peculiar stillness that made Sergeant Alvin York's skin crawl as he led his patrol through the mist-shrouded ridges of the Argonne forest. The Tennessee mountain man had survived 3 weeks of the most brutal fighting in American military history, but something in the quality of the silence ahead suggested that this day would test him in ways he had never imagined. His squad of 17 men moved like ghosts through the shell-torn landscape, their objective a German machine gun position that had been holding up the advance of the entire 82nd Infantry Division. The German defensive system in this sector had been constructed by Hauptmann Friedrich von Seckendorf, a Bavarian engineer who had studied American tactics with the methodical precision of a scientist. His machine gun nests were positioned to create a murderous crossfire that had already claimed hundreds of American lives, and his snipers had been systematically picking off officers and non-commissioned officers to disrupt American command structure. Von Seckendorf believed that the Americans, despite their numerical superiority, lacked the tactical sophistication to overcome properly prepared defensive positions. Private First Class Mario Muzzi from the 307th Infantry Regiment found himself face-to-face with the reality of industrial warfare when his unit encountered a German poison gas attack near Hilt 144. The mustard gas, delivered by artillery shells that burst with an almost gentle whisper, created a yellow cloud that drifted across the battlefield like a malevolent spirit. Muzzi's gas mask saved his life, but he watched in horror as men who had been too slow or to panic to protect themselves writhed in agony. As the chemical burned their lungs and eyes, the American Medical Corps, led by doctors and nurses who had volunteered for service despite having no military experience, struggled to cope with wounds that defied all previous medical knowledge. Captain Harvey Cushing, a neurosurgeon from Boston, had established a field hospital in a captured German bunker, where he performed surgery by lamplight while artillery shells exploded overhead. The young doctor's innovations in treating traumatic brain injuries would revolutionize battlefield medicine, but at the moment, he was simply trying to save as many lives as possible with inadequate supplies and equipment. York's patrol had been stalking the German position for nearly 2 hours when they stumbled into an ambush that changed the course of the battle. The Germans, led by Lieutenant Paul Vollmer, had positioned themselves in a natural depression that provided perfect concealment, while offering clear fields of fire in all directions. The initial burst of machine gun fire killed 6 Americans instantly and wounded 3 others, leaving York and his remaining men pinned down behind a fallen log with no apparent means of escape. According to the detailed combat reports compiled by military historians and preserved in the Congressional Medal of Honor files, what happened next would become one of the most celebrated individual acts of heroism in American military history, though York himself would always maintain that he had simply done what any soldier would do in similar circumstances. The German machine gunners, confident that they had eliminated the American patrol, began to expose themselves as they prepared to advance and finish off the survivors. York, drawing on skills learned hunting in the Tennessee mountains, began picking off the German soldiers with his rifle, using the same patience and accuracy that had made him a legendary marksman. In his home state, each shot was carefully aimed and deliberately placed, and within minutes, the German position began to fall silent. Lieutenant Vollmer, realizing that his carefully planned ambush was being systematically destroyed by a single American soldier, made the decision that would save his life and the lives of his remaining men. Rising from his concealed position with his hands raised, he called out in English for his men to surrender. The sight of their officer giving up broke the will of the German defenders, and one by one, they began to emerge from their hiding places with their hands raised. When the shooting stopped, York found himself surrounded by 132 German prisoners, including 4 officers and numerous non-commissioned officers. The Tennessee sergeant had single-handedly eliminated a machine gun position that had been holding up the advance of an entire division, and his actions would clear the way for the American forces to continue their push toward the vital railway junction. That was their ultimate objective. The psychological impact of York's exploit rippled through both armies. American soldiers, who had been struggling against seemingly insurmountable odds, began to believe that individual courage and determination could overcome even the most sophisticated defensive systems. The German defenders, who had been confident in their ability to hold their positions indefinitely, began to question whether they could withstand the seemingly endless waves of American attackers, who appeared to possess an almost supernatural determination to continue fighting regardless of casualties. General John Joseph Pershing stood before the massive tactical map in his headquarters at Sully, studying the red pins that marked German positions, with the intensity of a chess master contemplating a crucial endgame. The date was October 15, 1918, and the American expeditionary forces had been grinding forward through the Argonne forest for 3 weeks at a cost that made even the most hardened veterans question the price of victory. Nearly 90,000 American casualties had been sustained, yet the vital railway junction at Sedan remained in German hands, and the enemy's defensive system showed no signs of collapse. The German High Command, led by General Max von Gallwitz, had begun to recognize that the American offensive represented more than just another Allied attack. It was a fundamental shift in the balance of power that threatened to end the war. On terms dictated by the United States, von Gallwitz had been systematically withdrawing his forces from forward positions, trading space for time while inflicting maximum casualties on the advancing Americans. His strategy was designed to demonstrate that even defeat would come at such a horrific cost, that the Americans would be forced to negotiate rather than continue the slaughter. Major General Hunter Liggett, commanding the First Army, had spent sleepless nights reorganizing his forces for what he knew would be the final phase of the offensive. The American divisions had been reorganized, with veteran units from earlier phases of the battle reinforced by fresh troops who had just arrived from training camps in the United States. The logistics of supplying such a massive force across terrain that had been systematically destroyed by 4 years of warfare required innovations in military transportation that would influence American military doctrine for decades to come. Captain Eddie Rickenbacker, America's leading fighter ace, climbed into the cockpit of his Sped 13 fighter plane for what he knew would be one of the most dangerous missions of his career. The American air offensive had been designed to gain control of the skies above the Argonne forest, but German pilots, many of them veterans of the legendary flying circus squadrons, had been fighting with the desperation of men who knew that defeat meant the end of their nation's military ambitions. Rickenbacker's mission was to lead a squadron of American fighters against a German airfield that had been launching daily attacks against American supply columns. The renewed American assault began on October 21st with an artillery barrage that surpassed even the opening bombardment of the offensive for 1,000 guns, including massive railway artillery pieces that had been specially constructed for this battle, pounded German positions with high explosive and gas shells that turned the Argonne forest into a landscape that resembled the surface of an alien planet. The psychological impact of the bombardment was as important as its physical effect. German soldiers, who had withstood weeks of constant attack, began to question whether their defensive positions could survive such concentrated firepower. As detailed in the comprehensive operational histories compiled by the U.S. Army War College, the final phase of the Meuse-Argonne offensive represented the first time in military history that American forces had demonstrated their ability to conduct sustained operations on a scale comparable to the major European powers, marking the emergence of the United States as a global military force. Private First Class Frank Buckles of the 1st Infantry Division found himself advancing through terrain that defied description when his unit attacked German positions near the village of Romagne. The landscape had been so thoroughly pulverized by artillery that it resembled a moonscape, with shell holes so deep that men could disappear entirely when they fell into them. The smell of death and decay hung over the battlefield like a physical presence, and Buckles had to fight the urge to vomit as he stepped over the remains of soldiers from both armies who had died in earlier phases of the battle. The German resistance began to crumble as American forces, supported by French tanks and artillery, pushed forward with a momentum that seemed to feed on itself. Whole German units, cut off from their supply lines and facing annihilation, began to surrender en masse. The sight of thousands of German prisoners streaming toward the rear had a profound psychological impact on both armies. The Americans began to believe that victory was finally within their grasp, while the Germans started to question whether continuing the fight served any purpose beyond prolonging the agony. Colonel Douglas MacArthur, commanding the 84th Infantry Brigade, led his men in a dawn assault on German positions that had been considered impregnable just days earlier. The young officer, who would later become one of America's most famous generals, demonstrated the kind of personal leadership that inspired his soldiers to follow him through the most dangerous situations. MacArthur's tactical innovations, including the use of infiltration tactics borrowed from German assault teams, helped break the stalemate that had characterized the earlier phases of the offensive. The collapse of the German defensive system accelerated as American forces began to achieve breakthrough after breakthrough. The railway junction at Sedan, which had been the ultimate objective of the offensive, finally came within range of American artillery. The strategic implications were clear to commanders on both sides. If the Americans could cut the railway line, the entire German position on the Western Front would become untenable. The end of the war was no longer a question of if, but when. The morning of November 1st, 1918, revealed a battlefield that bore no resemblance to the pastoral French countryside that had existed before the war. Corporal James Donovan of the 2nd Infantry Division picked his way through the ruins of what had once been the village of Beaugency, his boots crunching on broken glass and debris that had once been homes, churches, and shops. The final phase of the Meuse-Argonne offensive had achieved its strategic objectives, but the cost had been measured in human suffering that would haunt the survivors. For the rest of their lives, the German Fourth Army, commanded by General Friedrich von Lossberg, had begun a fighting withdrawal toward the Belgian border, destroying everything of military value as they retreated. Bridge demolitions, railway cuts, and systematic destruction of roads and communication lines turned the American advance into a logistical nightmare that tested the organizational abilities of commanders who had learned their trade in the crucible of the world's first industrial war. Von Lossberg's retreat was a masterpiece of military engineering, but it could not disguise the fact that German resistance was collapsing under the weight of American numerical superiority and industrial capacity. Major General John Leonard Hines, commanding the 3rd Corps, coordinated the final American push toward the Meuse River with the methodical precision of a man who had studied every aspect of combined arms warfare. His forces included elements from 6 different divisions, supported by French tanks, American artillery, and close air support from fighter squadrons that had gained control of the skies. Through sheer determination and superior numbers, the complexity of coordinating such a massive operation across terrain that had been systematically destroyed required innovations in military communication that would influence American doctrine for decades to come. Private Samuel Woodfill of the 5th Infantry Division earned the Congressional Medal of Honor on October 12 when he single-handedly destroyed 3 German machine gun positions that had been holding up his regiment's advance. The Indiana farm boy had demonstrated the kind of individual initiative that characterized American soldiers throughout the offensive, using skills learned in civilian life to solve tactical problems that had defeated more conventionally trained troops. Woodfill's actions were typical of hundreds of similar acts of heroism that had gradually worn down German resistance through the accumulated weight of individual courage and determination. The American Medical Corps, led by doctors and nurses who had volunteered for service despite having no military experience, struggled to cope with casualties that had reached levels unprecedented in American military history. Base Hospital No. 21, established in a former German supply depot, had treated over 15,000 wounded soldiers, performing surgery and providing care under conditions that would have been considered impossible in peacetime. The innovations in battlefield medicine developed during the offensive would revolutionize trauma care and save countless lives in future conflicts, as documented in the official records maintained by the American Battle Monuments Commission. The final phase of the Meuse-Argonne offensive demonstrated that American forces had evolved from inexperienced volunteers into a professional military organization, capable of conducting sustained operations against the most sophisticated enemy forces in the world. Lieutenant Colonel George Patton, recovering from wounds received in a tank assault near Chepi, wrote in his diary that the offensive had transformed the American military from a collection of enthusiastic amateurs into a fighting force that could compete with any army in the world. The lessons learned in the Argonne Forest would shape American military doctrine for generations, influencing everything from small unit tactics to strategic planning. Patton's own evolution from a cavalry officer to a pioneer of armored warfare reflected the broader transformation that had occurred within the American Expeditionary Forces. The psychological impact of the American success rippled through both armies and the civilian populations of the warring nations. German soldiers, who had been confident in their ability to hold their defensive positions indefinitely, began to question whether continuing the fight served any purpose beyond prolonging their own suffering. American troops, who had entered the battle with little experience of modern warfare, had gained confidence in their ability to overcome any obstacle through determination and superior firepower. The strategic situation on the Western Front had been fundamentally altered by the American success in the Argonne Forest. The vital railway junction at Sedan was now within range of American artillery, making it impossible for the Germans to supply their forces along the entire front. The German High Command, faced with the prospect of complete military collapse, began to seriously consider the possibility of negotiating an end to the war. Before their army disintegrated entirely, the final American casualties of the offensive were still being evacuated from field hospitals when reports began reaching division headquarters that German representatives were requesting negotiations for an armistice. The news spread through the American lines like wildfire, creating a mixture of relief and disbelief among soldiers who had been fighting for their lives. Just hours earlier, the war that had seemed like it would continue forever was suddenly approaching its end, and the American forces that had proven themselves in the Argonne Forest would play a crucial role in determining the terms of peace. The 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month of 1918 brought a silence to the Western Front that seemed more profound than any sound that had preceded it. Private Daniel Edwards of the 42nd Infantry Division lowered his rifle and stared across no man's land at German soldiers who were emerging from their trenches with the same mixture of disbelief and exhaustion that he felt in his own bones. The Great War was over, and the Meuse-Argonne offensive had written the final chapter in American military history's most transformative campaign. General John Joseph Pershing received the armistice notification at his headquarters in Chaumont, but his thoughts were with the 26,000 American soldiers who had died in the Argonne Forest and would never see their homeland again. The price of victory had been measured in human suffering that would haunt the survivors for the rest of their lives, but the strategic objectives had been achieved. The German military machine had been broken, and the United States had emerged from the conflict as a global military power that would shape the 20th century. The final German commander in the Argonne sector, General Friedrich von Lossberg, surrendered his remaining forces to American officers with the formal courtesy that had characterized professional military relationships throughout the war. Von Lossberg's defensive system had been one of the most sophisticated in military history, but it had been overcome by American determination, industrial capacity, and the willingness to accept casualties that European commanders had considered unacceptable. The lessons learned from studying German defensive tactics would influence American military doctrine for decades to come. Major Charles Whittlesey, the commander of the Lost Battalion, emerged from a field hospital where he had been recovering from wounds received during the final phase of the offensive. The New York lawyer had become a national hero, but he carried psychological scars that would never fully heal. His experience in the Argonne Forest had demonstrated that modern warfare demanded more than just courage. It required a willingness to endure suffering that tested the limits of human endurance. The American Expeditionary Forces began the long process of demobilization with the same methodical efficiency that had characterized their combat operations. Soldiers who had been forged into a professional military organization in the crucible of the Argonne Forest now faced the challenge of returning to civilian life in a nation that had been fundamentally changed by their sacrifice. The technical innovations developed during the offensive, from improvements in artillery tactics to advances in battlefield medicine, would become the foundation for American military supremacy in future conflicts. As recorded in the comprehensive historical analysis compiled by the U.S. Army Center of Military History, the Meuse-Argonne offensive represented a watershed moment in American military development, demonstrating that the United States possessed both the industrial capacity and the human resources necessary to project military power on a global scale. Sergeant Alvin York returned to his Tennessee mountains as the most famous American soldier of the war, but he carried with him memories of the Argonne forest that would influence his pacifist beliefs. For the rest of his life, the mountain man who had become a national hero represented the transformation of American society. During the war, a nation of immigrants and farmers had produced soldiers capable of defeating the most professional military forces in the world. York's Medal of Honor citation would inspire generations of American soldiers, but the man himself would spend the rest of his life trying to forget the sound of machine guns. In the Argonne forest, the battlefield itself became a permanent memorial to American sacrifice, with military cemeteries that would serve as pilgrimage sites for families who had lost sons, fathers, and brothers in the fighting. The Meuse Argonne American Cemetery, established near the village of Romaigny, became the largest American military cemetery in Europe, containing the graves of more than 14,000 soldiers who had died in the offensive. The rows of white crosses stretching across the French countryside would serve as a permanent reminder of the price that had been paid for victory. The strategic implications of the American success in the Argonne forest extended far beyond the immediate military situation. The United States had demonstrated that it possessed the capability to conduct sustained military operations on a scale comparable to the major European powers, marking the emergence of America as a global military force. The lessons learned during the offensive would influence American military doctrine throughout the 20th century, from the development of combined arms tactics to the integration of air power. With ground operations, the Meuse-Argonne offensive had lasted 47 days and involved more than 1 million American soldiers, making it the largest military operation in American history to that point. The battle had cost the United States 26,000 dead and 95,000 wounded, but it had achieved its strategic objectives and demonstrated that American forces could overcome any obstacle through determination, superior firepower, and the willingness to accept casualties that European commanders had considered prohibitive. As the survivors of the offensive began their journey home, they carried with them the knowledge that they had participated in a battle that would be remembered as long as military history was studied. The Meuse-Argonne offensive had not only ended the Great War, it had announced the arrival of the United States as the dominant military power of the 20th century.